want to get us into our next session. And to do so, we will introduce Preserving History, Providing Information, Supporting Democracy, exploring the unique roles of American institutions. The significance of our next session will be evident when we welcome our distinguished guests to the stage, as we explore the unique role of American institutions and continue to consider the impact archives, libraries, and museums can have in the fight against anti-Semitism. We will do so with two of the leading thinkers of the day. The Honorable Dr. Carla Hayden serves as the 14th Librarian of Congress, where President Obama appointed her in 2016. Dr. Hayden is the first woman and the first African American to lead the National Library. The Honorable David S. Ferriero serves as the 10th Archivist of the United States, where President Obama appointed him in 2009. Mr. Ferriero is responsible for preserving and providing access to the records of the U.S. government, including all presidential libraries. Dr. Hayden, Mr. Ferriero, it is a privilege and honor to share the stage with you and to have you join us for this important conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Let's dive right in. This afternoon, we have been talking about the global rise in anti-Semitic incidents, something that has been deeply felt in communities across the United States and around the world. This session is an opportunity to discuss how vital democratic institutions, such as the institutions you lead, can respond and work to create a foundation for positive change. Dr. Hayden, how should we look to archives, libraries, and museums, places of memory and places of learning, to guide us in this moment?
The main mission of libraries, and my colleague, Ferriero, I think, will join me in this with archives, is to make sure that records, information, documentation about history and culture is available. And there's a quote that I really think about when I think about what the role is and what libraries and archives do. A library is a never-failing spring in the desert. And when you are confronting challenges of misinformation, misappropriation, all types of things, libraries and museums as well, and archives can be that spring. And David, I'm going to turn it to you because we are colleagues in making sure that we are those points in the desert many times.
I'm following up on Louise's comment about trusted sources, and libraries, museums, and archives have been identified as trusted sources. So much more important these days that people have places they can go to find the truth. And that's what our institutions do. For the National Archives, we're responsible, as Michael said, for collecting, protecting, and encouraging the use of the records of the United States government. And unlike some other governments, we collect all of the records, the good stories and the bad stories. So if you're interested in doing research, you should be able to find accurate information in our institutions. That's why we're considered trusted sources.
David, let's stay with you for a moment and sort of work off of that. Do you see a path for public institutions to awaken the diverse audience they serve to the history, scope, and realities of anti-Semitism? In particular, how do we equip them with accurate information?
One of the themes that impressed me in the previous session was something that I believe with my entire body, that the best way is telling stories, is to use the records. And as I tell my staff, we have, in the National Archives, we have close to 16 billion pieces of paper. And every one of those is a story. So mining the the records to tell those stories, those individual stories of how we got to where we are, I think is the best way to do that.
And if I could jump in too with that, with the Library of Congress, for instance, in 2004, a major exhibition and publication that's still in print, From Haven to Home, 350 Years of Jewish Life in America, one chapter. And it was distinguished scholars and people who were mining the collections, and our National Archives were one of the partners with this. One entire chapter is on the history of American anti-Semitism. And the photograph from the Prints and Photographs Division is very disturbing. As David said, it's the good and the bad. It's a photo of the lynching of Leo Frank, 1950, a postcard. So by presenting the information, presenting the good, the bad, and also different perspectives, that's one way that we can make sure that people are equipped.
I want to thank you, Dr. Hayden, because I was at the Center for Jewish History at that time when we partnered with the Library of Congress to present From Haven to Home, and it was really an opportunity for the first time in a long time to be able to tell the story of the Jewish experience to public audiences and across public institutions. So thank you for bringing that up. And I'll pose this next question to the two of you. Do you see how do we invite people to carry the lessons that they've learned in the institutions that we are at, particularly your institutions, as they navigate an increasingly disorienting world?
I also just have to say that the exhibit is now online. So that's using the tools of today to make sure that you present the information. So just because the exhibit and the book is still available, that you have it online. And having diversity in the people who work in our institutions is extremely important. And making sure that they are collecting materials sensitive to presentations and sensitive to what we are presenting. David, I know you've worked on that quite a bit.
Yeah, this is an opportunity to say a few words about a major initiative here triggered by the events of the past couple of years. An Archivist task force on racism was created to take a look at how we are, as an institution, handling the issues of diversity, inclusion in our own operation, but more importantly, looking at the audiences that we're serving to ensure that we're covering in our exhibitions and educational programs the
sound.
David, your sound cut out. I think you are muted.
In the previous session, Darius raised the question that he's grappling with in Poland: who is the we? And that's exactly what this task force is looking at. Who is the we? How do we ensure that the voices of the entire population are recorded and captured and celebrated in our work?
So, Dr. Hayden, hearing about what David just said, how can institutions challenge us to heed the warnings of the past, recognizing the conditions of the present, and really setting out to take action? Task forces like the one that Mr. Ferriero just mentioned on racism are one of what I imagine many strategies that are being deployed at public institutions.
And other strategies include public presentations of context and content and having exhibits. I know, David, we're part of a group that's working on an exhibit that's going to be about unequal, it's called unequal representation in the government. And so taking the lead on making sure that we have public presentations and exhibits, and our online presence now is even more important in terms of getting the information out and making it accessible. We have, in one example of having also the right staff members who are attuned to the different cultural aspects and the histories. Anne Brenner of the Library of Congress's Cabaret section and division discovered rare children's picture books published for children in Hebrew. And she not only discovered them, but she started collecting and making sure that there were even more representations. And as she said, when she looked into it, that this is now an online collection of rare children's books in Hebrew and Yiddish. She said, after all, the same countries that gave birth to so many of these beautiful books were also the countries in which the Jews experienced it, deportations, and eventually the Holocaust. And it's not surprising if they survive only here. And so that aspect of making sure that the materials are preserved and then presented is an important part of what libraries and archives can do.
As we think about the unique roles, of institutions that you lead, the collections housed at the Library of Congress and the National Archives teach lessons that prompt people to look outside and attend to public life and share the truth with others, as we have discussed, as you all have discussed. Your institutions help surface lesser-known histories and connect public audiences to new research and scholarship, and ultimately to new understanding. Among the countless examples at the Library of Congress of collections with a lasting impact in the fight against anti-Semitism are the papers of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was the United States ambassador of the United Nations when he delivered a historic speech in November of 1975, challenging the world order after the UN declared that Zionism is racism. Dr. Hayden, what is it about this collection or others that come to mind that help the public understand the need to safeguard knowledge?
It gives context to what is happening in the present day, and to understand and read, and David, we've encountered this quite a bit, to read the actual words of people who participated in different events that we're looking at, to be able to have the real thing is, I think, critical to giving people context, to being able to arm people with the facts. And sometimes that's difficult to ferret out, so that being a trusted source. Also making sure that we collect the papers and and now in the digital age, we're going to have to definitely move in terms of what we preserve and how we preserve it, but to make sure that we are being part of the discussions and we are providing factual information. And David, you were in the highlight with that.
And I want to kick this over to David for a moment, sort of pulling in collections at the National Archive, if I could. When we look at the National Archives under that same lens, we might think of the hundreds of millions of pages related to the Third Reich from before, during, and after World War II. Particularly poignant among those collections are the original Nuremberg race laws from September 1935 that institutionalized the legal framework for the systematic persecution of the Jews of Germany. So, David, most of us could never grasp the magnitude of historical discovery that lives within your institutions and within archives and libraries and museums in general. How can these institutions call upon their collections to better inform public discourse and mobilize our collective memory?
That is the primary mission of both of our institutions. And let me just be honest with you about how challenging it is in today's climate. 2 monumental statues on either side of the entrance on Pennsylvania Avenue here advise the passersby study the past, and past is prologue. And I spend all of my time trying to get people online in the door to do exactly that. We're in a climate where history is not is being rewritten, is being distorted, just as science is being distorted in terms of COVID and vaccination. It is an incredible. Simon Schama called it the collapse of truth. It is every day trying to figure out ways of counteracting the false information that's being purveyed and being believed, especially by young people. So all of our efforts in terms of our educational activities focused on teachers and young people are trying to use our primary sources in curriculum development and educating teachers and students about what our history actually is.
And if I could echo that, the education programs, the exhibit programs, all of the efforts to collect, Alberto Manuel in his History of Reading has a chapter, Forbidden Reading. And he says, as centuries of dictators, tyrants, slave owners, and other illicit holders of power have always known, an illiterate crowd is the easiest to rule. And if you cannot limit or prevent people from learning to read, you limit its scope. And it then goes on to book burning, all types of examples of limiting access to books and information. And so in our role, we have to be vigilant that we get the support. David, you know about this too, when your budgets are being challenged or you have oversight in terms of why do you have this or why are you collecting that? That's a major challenge at times in terms of staying true to our mission of presenting the truth.
And I think it's important to touch on that for just another moment, which is we are still experiencing and seeing book burnings in the world. We are still seeing books banned in classrooms across this country. We are still seeing artists and those who dissent having their speech and their work censored. And it is really, it is amazing to see all of these decades later that what were these violent book burnings in Nazi Germany might not necessarily be the same site today, but books are still, ideas are still being challenged and threatening to individuals of power. So I do appreciate you bringing that up. If staying for a moment with the particular collections that I mentioned, if I were to take a page out of Professor Tim Snyder's book on tyranny, where he describes the primary American tradition of considering history only when our political order seems imperiled, and to some extent, I imagine we are living through that moment. We are continuing to live through that moment as we speak. What would you recommend to cultural institutions as they work to create specific opportunities for non-Jewish people to understand, dissect, contextualize, and confront anti-Semitism in venues that they trust to give them accurate information?
And
Dr.
that's
Hayden?
the key. And that's the key phrase, give opportunities. So for example, you can have an exhibit and when you exhibit religious texts, you can have a Hebrew scroll alongside a Persian Quran or a Coptic Bible or all of these types of things. So when you have your exhibits, you provide opportunities in places and in spaces that are not segregated. They're integrated into whatever we do. And what music division, all of the different divisions have an opportunity and can present an opportunity to expose everyone to what they might not have been had that opportunity in any other situation. And so it's, someone said we can make it so much a part of that they might not even realize that that's what they're getting. A little subversive, but it definitely is a way to make sure that we are doing those things. For instance, we have for the first time a treasures exhibit gallery that will be at the Library of Congress, the David M. Rubenstein Gallery. And the inaugural topic exhibit will be remembrance. And that's where we will have all types of material that everyone coming to that exhibit will be able to see.
David?
I would also just reinforce another theme from the previous session about the power and value of social media and the importance of getting your content where the people are, not waiting for people to come to you. Figure out where they are and get the information that you want them to see on those platforms. Wikipedia was one of those mentioned. We have a huge presence on Wikipedia, the Digital Public Library of America. All of those sources of information are places where that we concentrate on getting our information out. I want to re-emphasize the importance of our Docs Teach site on the National Archives, where we have a community of teachers and educators who are developing curriculum, and much of the curriculum that has been developed already deals with the Holocaust, and teachers are using our primary sources to tell that story.
And of course, the library has the same type of thing with loc.gov. So those are important vehicles, and that social media, even making sure that you are, you could tweet, you could do all kinds of things, but having a robust presence and connecting it to your collections, always connecting it to your collections if you can.
And another way that National Archives material is being presented to the public is through our collaborations with other institutions. So much of the material on the walls of the National Holocaust Museum, U.S. Holocaust Museum, come from the National Archives. We loan our material to other institutions. So that's another way that our primary sources get shared. And as you said, there's nothing more powerful than seeing the original document. Yeah. Those Nuremberg laws, for instance, when I saw them for the first time, there's just a gut reaction to seeing those signatures on those laws.
As institutions represent the specificity of anti-Semitism, we must acknowledge the persistent facts and other forms of discrimination. I think it's important that we depict anti-Semitism within the broader context that gives members of the public an opportunity to achieve new understanding. Any thoughts on how to address this difficult and necessary work? Dr. Hayden?
I'm thinking of the recent Rosa Parks exhibit and being able to also show in that presentation how she reached out to other groups, was part of the larger discussion about racism, anti-Semitism, everything, and that you have that opportunity to show those connections in ways that might be unexpected. People might not have thought that, and in the women's suffrage exhibit, for instance, there was an aspect of acknowledging that, and things that are, you would say, oh, the Veterans History Project. Well, quite a bit of what happens with the oral histories in the Veterans History Project covers and contains aspects that are relevant to this. So dealing with inequities and difficult parts of this history and I say this history, and as someone who's a participant in another part, it is core to our mission now that we have to be part of the discussion.
David?
So I talked about the statues on Pennsylvania Avenue. One of the statues on Constitution Avenue delivers the message, vigilance is the price of liberty. We need to be paying attention to these challenges to our history and counter them with the facts. We have the evidence in our institutions, and we need to be vocal about challenging where we see disinformation being shared.
And courageous, David. I think you've been very courageous, and everyone knows that, about the fact that we have to stand up and say, no, we're going to present this information.
So let's stay on that for a moment. Vigilant and courageous, if we could. Help people. We've got thousands of people from around the world right now who have tuned in to this conversation. Many coming out of museums and libraries and archives and universities, working with students beyond the university world and members of the general public. How do they stay vigilant? How do they act courageous? How do other institutions step up and do the hard work that we all know is necessary?
I'm glad you mentioned students, because the Library of Congress and the archives, we have fellowships and internships and that. So making sure that there's that pipeline, connecting with universities and colleges, connecting with people who are doing things, because we have to make sure that there's continuity and that there are opportunities to mine our collections and develop our collections even more. And that's the vigilance in making sure that we have the representation, that people are going to be joining our institutions that can carry on.
One of the huge challenges that we're all facing is the disappearance of civics education in the curriculum. It's slowly coming back, but we have a huge problem with generations. It's not just young people, but it's their parents too, who don't understand how the government works or what their responsibilities. They're pretty sure of their rights, but they have no sense of their responsibilities as an American citizen. So a huge part of what both of us are doing is trying to compensate for that, in terms of our programming and education activities.
And that's a problem, I imagine, that your colleagues around the world heading up national
Yes.
libraries or national archives are facing, perhaps more significantly than we are here in the United States. What might you suggest that they do? What advice do you have for them?
The partnerships and the connections are very helpful, and reaching out. In the Library of Congress, for instance, has very robust international presence, and so making sure that we have the opportunity to be support for other institutions. And also there are the networks of public libraries. I have to mention those. I have a background in that. They definitely need the online presence that our institutions can provide, the resources that could be at the fingertips of people wherever they can get online, and that's very important.
On the international scene, since you mentioned that, there is something called the International Open Government Initiative, which brings together my peers from around the world, and some of Carla's peers also, the archivists and librarians from around the world, with other public officials from foreign governments to talk about and work on ways of opening up the records in the ways that are similar to how open the records are here in the United States. So there is a fair amount of international work that is for us anyway, resuming after 4 years of not being in favor.
I want to come back to Dr. Hayden for a moment. You mentioned public libraries. I read a stat which really, it blew my mind. It was that almost 1/3 of Americans are visiting public libraries, let's say pre-COVID, visiting public libraries on an annual basis. Can you help offer some perspective about the power of the public library in our communities?
Oh my God. They are opportunity centers. They are the first line for not only information, life-saving information, and support. Think about the turn in COVID when there were so many people in rural areas, other areas that didn't have access to the internet. And the public libraries in this country, they took their mobile units out in the community so that people could connect. They did so much. And that role of being that first line, people come into public libraries with their prescriptions from their recent medical visit and put it there. So they are in every community. They also are at times the first in civic budgets to be cut. And I just have to say that that's another access issue. When you cut public library hours or you cut budgets, you're cutting people's access.
Just a little perspective I want to offer. When I said almost 1/3 of Americans, the stat was almost 120 million Americans visiting a public library.
Yes, more than all of the sports things, baseball, football, all of that.
Let me comment on that. Since I was the director of the New York Public Libraries, when we did that study in terms of who the competition was, and all the museums combined in, sorry, Louise, all the museums combined in New York City and all of the sports venues, the New York Public Library outperformed all of them.
Yes, consistently.
And when you look at major urban centers around this country, and I imagine very comparable in other Western democracies, it is the public libraries that, come back to a point that Dr. Hayden said, are on the front line. They are not just going in there to take out a book, but these librarians, these they are educating and helping the public navigate the moment that we're in.
And also, I have to mention e-government. And David, you know about e-government quite a bit. When you require people to get online, to get any kind of interaction with the government, where are quite a few people going to go if they don't have high-speed internet? So that's another aspect of it.
And that's for large urban libraries. That's where the immigrant population learns what they need to know to become an effective American citizen. It's through their public library.
I want to shift focus for just a quick moment because I'd like your perspective on something. So in my opening remarks, I referenced an educator making a comment about opposing views, and not asking you to weigh in on that. But can we talk about the importance of educators getting access to the information they need to be able to go back into their classrooms and help students understand historical events that, quite frankly, we can't expect every educator to be an expert in? But it is your institutions and those around the world that are the evidence of those moments. Perhaps you could weigh in on that.
I don't mind saying that about that particular aspect.
Then please do.
There are facts, and there is acknowledged, or there's truth. So that was very upsetting. I have to say. That certain, and there's an ignorance factor there. People and you have to say, okay, maybe that was something that someone, that's why it's so important that we do the work that we do. Because there are times when we have to say there is no opposing view.
As we prepare to conclude the panel, I want to give you an opportunity to, I heard our last panel loud and clear. I want to make sure we end every panel on a hopeful note. So as we look to the future, David, let's start with you. Thoughts for the future? What would you like the audience to know? What should your colleagues know?
I'm very proud of the work that my staff, my education staff, in 14 presidential libraries and here in Washington do every day to use the records to help, especially teachers and students, learn from primary sources the truth about our history. And I would say that as we move forward, the issues become more challenging, but there's a commitment and a passion on our part to ensure that we create an educated populace.
How do we, before Dr. Hayden jumps into that, how can we do that? How do we help move that forward in a thoughtful way?
We're working state by state with state educators to insert ourselves into the curriculum around civics education.
And the Library of Congress is doing the same, and also asserting and reaching out to the other libraries in the country, the public libraries in particular. In each state, there's a center for the book, and we are strengthening those relationships and using also our cadre of young at heart digital strategy librarians and archivists who are finding new ways to present materials and using those tools to get things out and to make them more accessible to as many people as possible. So I'm encouraged when I see that they're using these tools and thinking of the future and making sure that we can continue on our mission. So it is hopeful, and Ann Brenner and has colleagues and interns working with her.
Well, for those of us who have had the pleasure of getting to know Ann and seeing the incredible work they're doing, I want to extend our gratitude and our thanks to her and her colleagues. And really, I want to offer my appreciation. Perhaps this wasn't clear to our audience. It is not every day that we have the opportunity to have the Librarian of Congress and the Archivist of the United States join us on a panel to talk about an issue that to some extent is very much focused on our community, the Jewish community, but in this case is really a chance to explore well beyond that. So thank you, Dr. Hayden. Thank you, Mr. Ferriero. Your time and your participation means a great deal to us, and we are indebted for your expertise and your thoughtfulness. So thank you for being here.